Mr. President, I definitely want to agree with one thing my friend from Connecticut just said, which is there is a long record here on the president's nominee, and it's a record I want to look at. It's a record that I want to be sure that I can talk to the people I work for about as we go through this process, and this process will have some time. My guess is it'll take about the same amount of time that it has taken for the last two nominees, which means sometime in the months of September, in all likelihood, we'll be on the floor voting, and we'll see where that vote takes us. I would think that a lot of people have jumped to a lot of conclusions here. I wouldn't suggest that it was my friend Senator Blumenthal at all, but somebody had a news release yesterday at a news conference I was in. One of our fellow senators had apparently gotten out a little too quick, and the news release was Supreme Court nominee XXX in a blank will be the most extreme candidate that the president could have possibly picked. Another one of our colleagues said yesterday they didn't care who the president nominated, they wouldn't be for him. And we're going to hear a lot of that over the next few weeks. We've heard since, I know at least going back to 1975, that I think every single Republican nominee has supposedly been the nominee that would bring an end to so many things that are people try to focus on when these nominations come up. Gerald Ford's nominee of what turned out to be Justice Stevens in 1975, these exact same things were said then. I don't know that it's what the president said during the campaign that matters as much as what the nominee will say during the next few days. I do know that the job that the nominee currently has, and I want to talk to him, I want to look at the record, I want to visit with him about his philosophy personally before I reach a final conclusion, but I do know that the job that Judge Kavanaugh currently has is often cited as the second most significant court in the country, the D.C. Court of Appeals. I do know that his 100 most often cited opinions have been cited by more than 210 judges around the country. I do know that the Supreme Court has endorsed his opinions of the law at least a dozen times and adopted them as the opinions of the Supreme Court. Remember the way this works. The job that Brett Kavanaugh currently has is a job that, like all other circuit judges, the Court of Appeals before the court, but unlike all others, it is a court that often is the court that has the real jurisdiction over a constitutional case. So lots of cases, 12 years of looking at what he has done as a judge. I know there's some requests we ought to see every piece of paper that Brett Kavanaugh had in his hands when he was the staff secretary, the assistant to the president when George W. Bush was president. Well, that would be every piece of paper that came to the White House, because the job of the staff secretary is not to have an opinion on those pieces of paper. In fact, he's probably the highest level appointed official by the president in the White House, whose job is not to have an opinion, but to facilitate the work, to get paper to someone that it needs to be. I suppose we could get virtually every piece of paper from the National Archives and the George W. Bush Library, and that's possible, but not necessary and not justified. What is justified is to look at all of these opinions. What is justified is to look at the individual, to look at what he does on the court, to look at what he does in community, to look at his opinions. Now, these are, without any question, important responsibilities, not just for the president, but for the Senate. And Americans are reminded once again that it matters who's in the Senate. It matters who composes a majority in the Senate. My guess would be that a majority of votes 2.5 months or so from now will be cast for Judge Kavanaugh, and they'll be bipartisan in nature, and he will go to the court probably before the new term of the court begins October 1. In fact, that should be one of our goals here, to have a judge in place by that time. 3 of the current judges, by the way, on the court, Mr. President, were put on the court in an election year, in an off year. Justice Kagan, 2010, almost exactly analogous, a Democrat president, a Democrat Senate, put a Democrat nominee on the court who had, by the way, worked at the White House. The only difference was there wasn't this large body of work to demonstrate a commitment, we would hope, to the Constitution and the law. You know, the goal of a judge, in my mind, and I think in the mind of a vast majority of the people I work for, is to judge a case based on, in the case of a federal judge, a Supreme Court judge, the law and the Constitution. To look and be sure those match up, and to be sure that the law is applied as it's written, not as a judge thinks it should have been written, or the Constitution is applied as it's written, not as a judge thinks it should be amended. There is a way to pass a new law, and there's a way to amend the Constitution, but that is not to be done by the court. And it seems to me that in the Scalia tradition, the Gorsuch nomination tradition, we have a judge here who appears to be committed in every way to look at the law and enforce the law. I think it was Judge Scalia and others who have said that a good judge is often not happy with the opinion they have to render, because the opinion they have to render based on the facts and of the case may not be the way they'd like the case to work out at all, but that's not their job to decide how they'd like the case to work out. The job of a judge is to judge the application of the law and the application of the Constitution. You know, 7 justices, including our most recent nominee to the court, Judge Gorsuch, have served as law clerks on the Supreme Court. If he's confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh will be the 8th. His background, his training, his work as a circuit judge appear to qualify him in a significant way. He was a Supreme Court clerk for Judge Kennedy. And Judge Kennedy, by the way, this is something we also ought to be sure we're understanding what's happening here, has been on the court for 30 years, filling a vacancy created in 1987, serving on the court for 15 years after the person that nominated him to the court died. Talk about long-term impact of both the president who nominates and the Senate who confirms. 3 decades of impact on one of the branches of government is pretty substantial. Now, in addition to being a clerk for Judge Kennedy, Judge Kavanaugh was, as I said, he was not only the private sector, but for 5 years he served in the Bush administration. Probably the most important job he had in that administration was just simply seeing that things got done in an orderly way that produced a result. That was that job. In 2006, President Bush nominated him to serve on the D.C. Court of Appeals, and 12 years later, we're here today. Judge Kavanaugh's opinions are cited by judges around the country. The Supreme Court has, again, endorsed his opinion at least a dozen times. He's written that the judge's job is to interpret the law, not to make the law or to make policy. He went on to say, so read the words of the statute as written, read the text of the Constitution as written, mindful of history and tradition. It's an important mindful point there, which you would assume you would determine were done consistent with the law and the Constitution. Read the text of the Constitution as written, mindful of the history and tradition. Don't make up new constitutional rights that are not in the text of the Constitution. Don't shy away from enforcing constitutional rights that are in the text of the Constitution. That ends the quote of one of his many writings. We have lots of things to look at here. Since 2009, he's been the Samuel Wilson Lecturer at the Law School of Harvard. In addition to being a brilliant legal mind, he's devoted to his community, and as we saw the other night, to his family and to his faith. He spends his time coaching youth basketball, serving as a church volunteer, mentoring in local schools. His mom was a school teacher and went to law school while she was a school teacher and became eventually a judge. But he brings those qualifications to the court. I think this is an important part of our job, to advise and consent. But we have a lot of people who have rushed to a determination that they absolutely would not be for Judge Kavanaugh. I think a majority are likely to get to the determination that we should be for Judge Kavanaugh. I look forward to visiting with him over the next few days. I look forward to learning more about his philosophy as a judge and how he thinks the Supreme Court would be different, and how his job there may or may not vary from being on that second most important court in the country. My guess is he'll say it doesn't vary at all. The job of the Supreme Court judge, just like the job of a Court of Appeals judge, is to apply the Constitution, apply the law, and not to try to make the law or rewrite the Constitution. I look forward to that opportunity. I look forward to looking at many of the judge's opinions. I noticed 2 Pinocchios in the Washington Post today about one of the cases that's already been brought up. The determination of this argument about the right way to deal with a president while in office. Certainly not a nuisance lawsuit. If the topics of a lawsuit are wrong, if it's the wrong thing for the president to do, there is clearly a way to remove a president. That's the point, I think, in what will be a much discussed law journal article that Judge Kavanaugh was making. And he didn't suggest that the law now prohibited a president from being indicted. He just said the law, that there is a constitutional way to return a president to the status of private citizen, and then the president has all of the same vulnerabilities that a private citizen would have. 200 members of Congress file a lawsuit. There's a place in the Constitution that says what 200 members of the Congress should do if they think the president should be removed, and that place in the Constitution does not say, and you should harass the president all you can about everything you can, whenever you can. And it's going to be an interesting debate for the American people, but once again, they're going to be reminded as to how important the courts are, the incredible impact of the appointing power, the nominating power to the federal courts, and the partnership responsibility that the United States Senate has in that important impact. And I would yield the floor.